We have a special treat today. It is my privilege and honor to introduce this morning to our congregation here on this lovely Shabbat, Rabbi Ravid Tilles from Schechter. He is the Director of Jewish Life and Learning, which means that he spends his days thinking about, planning on what it is our kids need to develop a Jewish identity that's going to last them from their childhood all the way into their adulthood, that's going to give them the tools that they need in order to encounter a changing world. And he's here this morning to talk to us about how we might reach and teach our next generation and why that might matter to us. Rabbi Ravid Tilles, please.
Thank you, Rabbi Robinson, and thank all of you for having me here this morning. I'm a member of our community, but every time that I have the opportunity to share insight and words of Torah with all of you, I feel very grateful. And I'm grateful especially to Rabbi Robinson and to the other rabbinic and clergy colleagues who are sharing the bima with me this morning. When you sent me a text message a number of weeks ago asking me to speak about, quote, how do we engage the next generation, that is a very daunting and difficult task, even though it's something I think about. As Rabbi Robinson said, it's something I think about all the time. I am not so arrogant to think that I have the answers to such a question, but I can begin the process of thinking about, or explaining at least, how we talk about it. Look how great I'm doing at engaging the future generation. They can't even stand it. It's so exciting. She has so much to say. It's great. No, when I started to think about this, I thought about a story that happened to me pretty recently with a friend of mine. Now, this friend is the president of a large for-profit organization. He oversees a multi-billion dollar budget. He manages hundreds of people. And in his field, his company is considered pretty high profile. You could say that in his field, he's something of a big deal. And I remember one time I said to him, man, the stakes of your job are so high. And he said, no, Ravid, the stakes of my job are nothing compared to the stakes of your job, educating the next generation of Jews. And I realized something at that moment. I realized that my friend will say anything to make me feel good. No, the real truth is that he's right. The stakes of this work, the thought of how do we engage the future generations in Jewish life, the stakes of that question, I believe, could not be higher. And as I said before, I don't have the answer. And we can talk about strategies here if you want. We could talk about strategies and ideas, but they sometimes work, and then they sometimes don't. And then we try them again, and then they work, but then they don't again. And trying to come up with strategies is actually not what I want to talk about today. Instead, I want to talk about stances, guiding principles that I believe if we hold on to these guiding principles, then we actually stand a chance at answering that question and holding on to the ideals of engaging the future generations. So the three stances that I want to talk about today are authenticity, flexibility, and joy. Now, authenticity is kind of a bad word these days, actually. It's a little bit passé, and the reason is because it implies that there's a right way to do things or a wrong way to do things, or maybe even worse, a real way to do things. And so, for the most part, we try to avoid words like authentic because they can feel othering. But when I talk about authenticity in Jewish education, what I'm looking for is for teachers, parents, grandparents, educators, madrichim, advisors, the role models that are going to have the responsibility, the great high-stakes responsibility, looking for those role models to genuinely believe that what they are teaching is engaging. How can we engage a future generation if we have questions about how engaging Jewish life is? When I first started working at Schechter, I asked about our Parshat HaShavua curriculum, the weekly Torah readings. And the answer that I heard reflected a sentiment that I hear all too often in the world of Jewish education. They said, we teach the stories of the Torah until we get to Leviticus, and then we stop. We teach the fun, rich, compelling stories, and then we do something else. When it comes time to talk about laws or sacrifices or purity or the Mishkan. Now, I get that. I get that it's hard to teach about parts of our tradition that don't feel as imminent, that don't feel as obviously relevant. But my friends, as soon as we start deciding that there are parts of our tradition that are more interesting and more engaging than others, then we've opened the door for our students to also make that same decision in their lives. If we are authentic in our belief that our tradition, all of it, has inherent value, if we truly believe that, then our students will believe it as well. If we try to chase relevance, well, that is going to be an unending, fruitless enterprise. Because, listen, I consider myself pretty youthful, but the gap between me and my students gets bigger, by definition, gets bigger every year. And the gap between us and the future generations gets bigger. And I'm no trendsetter. I don't know about all of you, but I'm not the one at the front lines convincing kids what's cool or not. In fact, I remember one time I was teaching a lesson about Saul and Samuel, and I wanted to be really cool and edgy, and I connected it to Facebook, and I'll never forget, these kids said to me, quote, I'm pretty sure my grandma has a Facebook account. That's what it feels like. You think that you've caught up, but there are already 5 fads ahead of you. So let's not even begin to struggle and chase relevancy. Let's feel confident that what we're engaging them in is authentic, meaningful, holy work. Now, I see many teachers who are obsessed with trying to be relevant and engaging. And I got to tell you, I've never once talked to a Jewish adult who is engaged in Jewish life who said to me, you want to know why I'm engaged in Jewish life? It's because my Hebrew school had the best bouncy house. That doesn't happen. But what they will tell you is that their role models help them understand and see the value and the beauty of our tradition. Now, I've also heard people say, oh, I get it. You attract them with the interesting, and then you give them the boring. We could try that too. But my friends, if we actually think that part of our tradition is boring, if we write it off as irrelevant or archaic or antiquated, then we don't stand a chance in bringing our students along in their understanding of why it is actually as beautiful as we believe. Now, here's the problem. What if we don't? What if we don't actually connect to parts of our tradition? What if we actually find a lot of it problematic? This is something that Rabbi Robinson began to allude to this morning, because we all know that there's great beauty in Judaism, but there are also dark corners of our tradition that sometimes make us feel uncomfortable or even ashamed. Loving your neighbor as yourself, oh, that's awesome. It's timeless. But there are parts of our tradition that don't age quite as well. Ethos around gender inequality, heteronormativity, nationalism, and more, they don't align with a lot of contemporary morality. And so this brings me to my second guiding principle, which is flexibility. One of the most challenging of them all is actually found in this week's Parsha. We learn about the Ben Sorer Umoreh. The Torah tells us that if a man has a Ben Sorer Umoreh, translated as a wayward, defiant son, who does not listen to the voice of his father and to the voice of his mother, and does not obey them even after he disciplines him, take him, this son, into the center of town, decry his defiance, and the community shall stone him to death. Yikes. That is not easy to hear. And by the way, that is not our discipline statement of Schechter. Just want to be very clear. But there it is. A mitzvah, a commandment that is inscribed with holy ink in the holy scroll that many of you kissed as it was walking around, that is housed in this holy ark. Those words are there. And if that idea makes you feel uncomfortable, you're not alone. Our ancient rabbis, the sages, they also felt uneasy about these verses. So much so that the Talmud tells us in Sanhedrin that there has never actually been a Ben Sorer Umoreh, and it will never happen. Our sages tell us that a timeless mitzvah, if it's in the Torah, we should consider it sacred. A timeless, sacred mitzvah, our sages tell us, will never happen. What a powerful chutzpahdik statement. How can these ancient teachers, who, by the way, are as authentic as they come, how can they say that a mitzvah is not going to happen? It seems like they're upending Torah law. But they're not. They're not. Because when they say it's never going to happen, they don't say, yeah, it's yuck. We don't want to see that. We don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about something nicer. Let's talk about something more fun. Ben Sorer Umoreh, but let's go bounce in a bouncy house. They don't do that. They take seriously the law of the Torah, and they say it must mean something else. It can't possibly mean that. And so the rabbis, our ancient sages, thousands of years ago, decided to understand the mitzvah of ben sorer umoreh as allegory, as a teaching, so that we could understand that we all share communally in our responsibility to raise children together. That's how they chose to understand it. Now that might not actually be what the Torah meant. And I can imagine that the Torah could have said that in a much nicer way than they did. But there it is. The rabbis, instead of throwing out, discarding, avoiding a mitzvah that made them uncomfortable, that even to them felt a bit antiquated, the rabbis decided, no, let's be flexible here. Let's contextualize. Let's try to understand by asking questions and by grappling. I have a cousin who grew up engaged in liberal Jewish community, not that dissimilar from this synagogue itself. And in her mid-20s, by some fluke, she ended up on a Birthright Trip with an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who shared ideas that did not align with her perception of Jewish life. Now, what I'm about to say is not meant to be disparaging of any of my ultra-Orthodox colleagues, because just like I wouldn't want anybody to say that all liberal rabbis are the same, I wouldn't want to presume the same about my ultra-Orthodox colleagues. But my cousin in particular found that this rabbi that she was on the Birthright Trip with, that his teachings she described were homophobic, chauvinistic, and xenophobic. And she decided that if this is actually the Torah, and that she's been lied to the whole time, has been sold engaging and interesting and fun, lovely ideas, if she says, wait a minute, if this is actually Judaism, then I'm out. And she's actually still fairly disengaged from Jewish life because of that experience. I believe that we need to demystify our tradition, to lean into its complexity, because this is the way of our people. The most authentic way to engage in difficult text is to try to be flexible, is to, as it says in Brachot, Lamed leshoncha lomar lo yodea. Train your tongue to say, I don't know. I just don't know everything. I don't know why the Torah would say what it says sometimes, but it does. And if I authentically, truly, in my heart of hearts, believe that it's valuable, then I owe it to myself, my tradition, and we owe it to our children and the future generations to say, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. Let's lean into its complexity together. And my final stance, joy. It says in Tehillim, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, service God with joy. We should do work for God with joy. And to me, it's not just about serving God with joy, but we should understand that the service of God is joy. When I was asked to speak, when Rabbi Robinson sent me that text and said, can you please speak about engaging the next generation? A natural question could have been, sure, engage them in what? What are we trying to engage them in? Engage them in text learning? That sounds good. Engage them in mitzvot? Great. Engage them in chesed? Amazing. Engage them in prayer life? Absolutely. All of these are wonderful things to engage the next generation in. But underlying all of these dimensions of Jewish life, we should be doing our best to engage our next generation in joy. Don't use joy to engage. Engage them in joy. What's the difference? I've been really hard on bouncy houses today, because I wouldn't use a bouncy house to engage kids in tefillot. That's just some kind of wrapping, some kind of hook, some kind of gimmick to get them excited about something they're not already excited about. But it says in our Torah about the holiday of Sukkot, V'hayita ach sameach. You should always be happy during the holiday of Sukkot. So if you bring in a bouncy house for Sukkot in order to engage your students in the mitzvah of joy, well, then let them have their bouncy houses. That's okay. That's okay. Because if authentic Yiddishkeit, if joy is the goal, finding joy in prayer, finding joy in our chagim, finding joy in learning Torah, if that is the goal, instead of duping our kids into eating their vegetables of Torah and tefillot, but if actually the goal is joy, then they will be more joyful, and I believe more engaged. Friends, the struggle to engage the next generation is real. It's a moving target, and as my friend reminded me, the stakes are incredibly high. But if we, their role models, whether that be professional, personal, or communal, take a stance of authenticity, flexibility, and joy, then I believe that we actually stand a chance. We could actually engage the future generations, and if nothing else, it will be more joyful. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be your will, God. Amen.